I want to tell you how I came to the field of psychology, and this is little Kathleen here to help tell the story. That's me on my 5th birthday. My parents love this photo, and they post it on my Facebook wall almost every year. I came to psychology because I've been interested in communication ever since I was born. I was born with Moebius Syndrome, a disability characterized by facial paralysis and a lack of side-to-side eye movement. At an early age, I understood that the way I communicated was unusual and that people were confused by my lack of facial expression. So I became fascinated with communication, with facial expression, body language, and words. I became more expressive in other communication channels, something I now call alternative expression. My interest in communication led me to study psychology in college. And I set out to do my very first college term paper on Moebius Syndrome. I showed up to the library expecting to find pages and pages of answers, but actually I discovered that there was only a handful of psych papers ever published on Moebius Syndrome. And this was a problem for 2 reasons. First, psychologists weren't helping people with Moebius Syndrome. And second, I didn't have enough sources to write my term paper. And that was the crucial moment where I realized that I was uniquely qualified and motivated to do psychological research on facial paralysis and other disabilities and really build out support for those communities. So little Kathleen went to graduate school, became a social psychology professor, and has published the largest and most comprehensive studies of facial paralysis in psychology. For example, I documented that the alternative expression that I developed as a child is an effective strategy used by a lot of people with facial paralysis. So let's return to the photo of little Kathleen and notice that I am already very expressive. You can tell that I'm really excited about my bunny cake and I'm mimicking the bunny ears. Let's get philosophical for a minute. I want to understand and examine our underlying assumptions about disability. So experts categorize ways of thinking about disability in 3 broad models: the moral model, the medical model, and the social model. So under the moral model of disability, disabled people or their families are morally responsible for their disability. According to this model, disability is a punishment for sins, representation of evil, a curse, or a result of karma. We might call the moral model archaic, but it is the most common model of disability in the world. We still see evidence of this model in our culture today. Think of Hollywood villains like Freddy Krueger and most Bond villains. And even our kids' movies. The Disney villains Scar from The Lion King and Captain Hook from Peter Pan are literally named after their differences. These depictions perpetuate cultural associations between disability and evil in our culture today. And the medical model is the way most people in the West currently think about disability by default. This paradigm views disability as the direct result of pathologies in the body or mind, which it aims to cure. The medical model offers valuable innovations for treating uncomfortable and painful symptoms. However, this model locates the problem within the disabled individual and the responsibility within that individual, their family, and a little esoteric group of healthcare specialists. So limiting these responsibilities perpetuates the idea that disability is an exception rather than a common human experience. Our understanding of disability is incomplete until we consider social factors. And that's where the social model comes in. This model is used by many disability activists and scholars, and it asserts that society is the primary cause of disability, and the problem lies in society and not in the individual. Society's lack of accommodation of human variation is viewed as the cause of the disabling experience. Disability occurs because societies are constructed based on the assumption that everyone can, for example, walk, see, and hear. I have a riddle for you. There is an impairment that most Americans have, but we don't consider it a disability. Think for a minute about what this might be. Are you ready? It's refractive error. Or, in simpler terms, needing corrective lenses like glasses and contacts. So why isn't the need for corrective lenses considered a disability? Well, it's because it's common, removing stigma. Lenses seem like simple accommodations because they are widely available, effective, and inexpensive. But it's not that glasses and contacts are inherently easy to make. It's that we were motivated to devote the resources to doing so. In fact, glasses may be the first assistive technology developed in the 13th century. Our society values equity and inclusion, so we can and should do this for more human variations, no matter how common or rare. Disability is broadly defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Stereotypically, we picture a person in a wheelchair when we think about disability. It's literally the symbol of disability. The disability is actually much broader than that. Some disabilities are invisible, like chronic pain, learning disabilities, and significant mental health conditions. Others are quite noticeable, like facial paralysis or Down syndrome. About 20% of Americans have a disability, making it the largest minority group in the country. Like other isms, ableism is stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, or oppression of people with disabilities. This can be subtle, such as when someone avoids talking to a disabled person because they are afraid of saying the wrong thing, to overt, such as hiding people with disabilities away or relegating them to backroom jobs. Ableism is sometimes called the forgotten ism because it is often left out of conversations about minorities and diversity. At least 230,000 Americans are born with or develop facial paralysis each year. And facial paralysis can be congenital or present at birth, like Moebius Syndrome, or acquired at some point after birth, like from Bell's palsy, stroke, or injury. There are many ways to develop facial paralysis throughout one's life. From my research, I've interviewed and surveyed hundreds of people with facial paralysis. And the major theme from these conversations is that facial paralysis is highly visible but unrecognizable, meaning that when someone with facial paralysis walks into a room, strangers will notice their facial difference but not be able to put their finger on why they look different. They won't be able to tell that the person has paralysis per se. Indeed, people with facial paralysis hear all sorts of interpretations of their appearance. Did you just get back from the dentist? Are you having a stroke? Strangers are also misinterpreting a lack of facial expression as unhappiness or unfriendliness. In the largest survey of people with facial paralysis, I found that 1/3 had moderate to severe depression. And the main predictor of that depression was experiencing ableism. So for all of these reasons, the most common request from the facial paralysis community is greater public awareness to stamp out misconceptions and ableism. Human communication involves much more than facial expression. Indeed, my research finds that people with facial paralysis, especially those who are born with it, increase their expression in other channels, what I call alternative expression. People with facial paralysis report using their voice. One woman had the interesting observation that she felt like her voice was her face during communication. People use gestures, they use humor to disarm people, touch to create interpersonal closeness, and even style. One woman who was a nurse had taken to wearing a happy face pin as a way to put patients at ease. Meanwhile, here we are in the middle of a pandemic wearing face masks to prevent the spread of COVID-19. People with facial paralysis like me have been trying to educate the public about it for years. It took a global pandemic, but people without facial paralysis are finally starting to understand what it's like to not be able to smile at cashiers and passersby. People with facial paralysis are already experts at alternative expression, and those without can learn from us at this time. The first thing I did when I learned I needed to wear a mask was to engage my alternative expression and find a fun, cheerful mask. Pandemic, but make it fashion. And I also know how to smile with my voice and pepper in laughs. In some ways, face masks are the great equalizer for people with facial differences. They conveniently allow us to pass as normal, affording us civil and attention as we jaunt to the grocery store without being noticed. Although I will continue to wear a mask for a long time for health reasons, it does bring mixed emotions. Personally, I feel a little like I'm betraying my hard-won self-love and disability pride when I wear a mask that hides my facial paralysis. But at least I know that I am well equipped to communicate in the meantime. On the flip side, all of our pandemic video conferencing actually really puts me at a disadvantage. As a professor, I spend a lot of time talking to others via Zoom. And the little Zoom window really restricts alternative communication. So I find myself pushing my camera back so I can at least kind of capture my arms and torso and get some body language in there. The pandemic is normalizing adaptations that have long been used by the broader disability community. Accommodations disabled people fought for and were denied, like working from home, telemedicine, and grocery delivery, have now suddenly been adopted by society at large. When the majority of society is disabled by conditions surrounding the pandemic, accommodations suddenly seem justifiable to the public. This is the perfect illustration of the social model at work. When people with disabilities are in the minority again, don't forget these adaptations. My research shows that educating people about facial paralysis and to look for alternative expression, like I've done here today, reduces ableism. People with facial paralysis have developed skills to communicate without facial expression. And now the general public is being invited to rethink their communication as well. There are many human differences that result in diverse ways of expressing yourself, like culture, gender, and disability. When the pandemic ends, remember what you've learned about expressive diversity.